Hey guys, I'm back again. More like again. I was having some technical issues, I guess you could say. So we're gonna try and get through this again without any more issues, hopefully. So today, back on Cardboard Kitchen. I do hope that everybody who got a chance to play in the Murders at Karlov Manor pre-release events over the course of the weekend had a great time and enjoyed it. I hope you guys got some awesome pulls. Hope you got things that you wanted. Just because new set, new stuff. Let's get those decks upgraded. Let's get them running hopefully better. Let's play some more fun games in Commander if possible. So with that being said, I did wake up this morning. Someone posted a comment asking about mono black vampires or red black vampires and options and things like that like advice I might have for playing those things. While those are good in a sense, like mono black, your mana base is extremely well flushed out. You get all of the amazing mono black vampires that are really good. And you get a little more room to play with a couple of other different things, so that's always fun. Red black vampires can also be fun. You get to play a ton with the blood tokens that the Rakdos vampires predominantly make, and various things that use those blood tokens for various other purposes, which is really fun because like the commander you might choose is the guy that attacks and you sacrifice 2 blood tokens and you get to put a vampire from your hand into play tapped and attacking and it gains indestructible. So that's always a fun vampire to play. But in my personal opinion, since we're talking about vampires and we're doing a deck recipe and everything today, which is among one of the many things I want to do for the channel. For those of you that have been playing for a while, you know about this fella. You love this fella. He's an expensive fella. It's Edgar Markov. It's red, white, black vampires. I did try to make the list as wallet friendly as I possibly could with some of the choices on the mana base, just to try to help out a little bit. But obviously the mana base, it's in 3 colors. It's in 3 colors that don't ramp very well. So mana base requiring as much fixing, well, what I would believe is as much fixing as possible, being that it's budget friendly. A non-budget friendly would have tons more fixing capabilities in my opinion, but it's also not budget friendly. It's, the wallet's going to hate your guts. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Edgar Markov, for anybody that doesn't know, is 3 generic red, white, black for a 4/4 legendary creature vampire knight. So he has 2 abilities and 2 keywords. We'll start with the last ability. The last ability is that whenever Edgar Markov attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So 1, the ability includes itself. 2, the ability includes any vampires you control, not just the ones that are attacking. But Edgar himself does have to attack. So that's the downside to that ability is Edgar has to swing. Now that's not really much of a downside. We're going to move to his 2 keyword abilities. First strike, he hits first. Haste, he can attack the turn he comes in. Like, that's dope. He's not a 4/4 attacker. He's essentially a 6 mana 5/5 that hits first. That also gives a permanent bonus to all your other vampires in play. And his first ability, which is probably his best ability, I would argue that it's okay. I would argue that all of his abilities are relevant, but I would argue for the purposes of Commander and how games of Commander typically go, as far as like aggro decks go, his first ability makes this color combination, especially if you're playing Vampire Tribal, among one of the most aggro possibilities that you could play. And it's in a color combination that most often prefers to do mid-range stuff, which is kind of cool. Like, his ability lets you do aggro stuff, and the rest of the deck kind of lets you do mid-range. So you have your early and your middle game, and most control decks are going to be late game stuff. So that's kind of fun. But his first highly relevant ability, for a couple of different reasons, is his Eminence ability. Now, his Eminence ability is that this ability is always active, whether he's in the command zone or in play. And that ability is whenever you cast a vampire spell, you make a 1/1 black vampire creature token. So that's really good. Every vampire spell generates you a creature. So if it says vampire in your text line, like where it would normally say like legendary creature vampire or creature vampire or something like that, if it has vampire in that text line, whenever you cast it, if Edgar Markov is in your command zone or on your battlefield, you make a 1/1 black vampire creature token, which is relatively good. It's pretty strong. So I usually like to start with my lands whenever I do deck lists, just because I feel like flushing out my mana base is an easier priority to handle before putting things in the list, just because I personally, it doesn't matter what level of play I play at, I personally try to flush out an equal number of mana sources for each pip option. So like if I'm playing 2 colors, I try to make it so that there's roughly an even number of mana sources that make each color in that 2 color pip. The same for 3 color, 4 color, 5 color, all that namesake. Just so that like I should always have the appropriate mana for whatever spell I'm casting. So I usually try to flush out my mana base first. So starting with the mana base is Command Tower. It's a staple I would say it's a staple in any commander deck that's 3 or more colors. If you're 2 or fewer colors, there are things in your 2 color options that are going to, there's usually 1 or 2 things in each of the 2 color combinations to want you to prefer playing a particular land type over a command tower. So usually you would just put in, so like if I was in Simic and playing command tower, I would play Breeding Pool. Now you're probably going to play Breeding Pool in Simic anyway, but for, there's things in Simic that say, gets a bonus based on the number of forests you control, or gets an ability based on the number of islands you control. Well, Command Tower doesn't count as a forest or an island if you're in Simic, or in this case in Mardu, it doesn't count as a mountain, plains, or swamp. So anything, and again, I say Command Tower in 3+ colors because it's a little harder to fix appropriately in anything that's more than 2 colors. And anything that's more than 2 colors, with the exception of what I stated in the Better Mana Bases video, almost everything has roughly the same ability to fix appropriately. And that comes from the fact that Wizards has, for the most part, anytime they've done a land cycle, they've given us a full 10 land cycle. So again, I reiterate that all of that's with the exception of what I talk about in the Better Mana Bases video. If you haven't watched the Better Mana Bases video, please go do so. If you're new here and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. I'm trying to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. If I can hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of February, I'll talk to some people about potentially setting up a Patreon and maybe giving Patreon perks to people who are over on the Patreon. Again, if you like the video, hit that like button. Don't want to dawdle on this too much. I do know that based on what I've seen so far from the analytics, 2/3 of you people watching me are not subscribed. Well, if you keep coming back for these videos and you keep coming back to listen to what I have to say, maybe you're trying to compare what I say to what other content creators say and see how much relevance there is. If you're coming back to find all that out, just go ahead and hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you can be notified every time I upload one of these things. But we're going to jump back into it because I'm rambling a little too much and we've got a whole deck to go through and option choices and some stuff at the end I want to cover. So Command Tower, again, is a staple land in any deck that runs 3 or more colors, in my personal opinion. Exotic Orchard. So I don't like playing Exotic Orchard in for roughly the same reasons. I don't like playing Exotic Orchard in any deck that's not 3 or more colors. For the same reasons I really wouldn't play Command Tower in any deck that's not 3 or more colors. But Exotic Orchard is based on the different colors of mana your opponent's lands can produce. So it's a little... I like the land, kind of. I kind of like the land, but like, if you're playing red, white, and black, and you sit down at a table and all of your opponents are playing green, it'll make you green mana, but your green mana is only going to pay for your generic. However, because it states it only makes colors based on the color of mana your opponent's lands produce, if your opponent's playing one of those colorless Eldrazi decks, it's a dead land. It doesn't do anything because their land doesn't make colored mana, and because their land doesn't make colored mana, it won't make colored mana. So Eldrazi decks have started becoming a little bit more popular. That's also, there's something tied in with Eldrazi's with Rule 2 of the Kitchen, which we'll get to in a different video. The next land on the list is Path of Ancestry. If you're playing a tribal, typal, I know Wizards is calling it typal instead of tribal now, but if you're playing, a creature-themed deck, essentially, Path of Ancestry is a good one. It's basically a command tower that comes into play tapped, but it adds that you cast a creature spell with the same, that shares a creature type with your commander, you get to scry one. That's relevant. Again, you're in the vampire sub-type, tribe, typal thing. Voldaren Estate. It normally taps for a colorless, or you can pay 1 life to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool to cast a vampire spell. Or you can pay 5 and tap it and make a blood token, but the last ability costs you 1 generic less for each vampire you control. So if the game goes on long enough and you've got 5 vampires in play, you can use it to make a blood token. Blood tokens are artifact tokens that you can pay 1 to sacrifice them and then also discard a card in order to draw a card. So maybe you've got some cards in your hand that aren't really relevant for whatever reason, and you want to try to swap those out. If you've got blood tokens, you can pay 1, sack your blood token, discard a card, and then you get to draw a new card. So it's hand filtering, which can be relevant. Hand filtering is really hard to deal with in any color that isn't blue. It's hard to do as far as like actually filtering your hand or something of that nature if you're not really in blue. Even though blue's predominant thing is just, I want to hold all the cards. Savai Triome. The Savai Triome is relevant because it's a fetchable command tower, essentially, if you're playing relevant fetches, which this list is playing some of those fetches. It's a fetchable command tower that if it's late game and you draw it because for some reason you haven't fetched it yet, you can pay 3 and discard it to just draw a fresh card. Which is, it's one of those cycling triomes, and it's relevant. Nomad Outpost is the always enters tapped non-fetchable triome land. It comes into play tapped. You tap it for your choice of a red, a white, or a black. It's basically Savai Triome, except you can't fetch it and you can't cycle it. Again, I put this land in this list because I'm trying to be a little more budget friendly, a little more friendly on your wallet for this deck, but it's definitely a land I would take out and put something else in place of it if I'm playing a more like focused list of, I want to play this fixing or whatever the case is. Reflecting Pool. So I like Reflecting Pool more than I like Exotic Orchard. And the reason that is because Reflecting Pool says you can tap it to add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. So it's Exotic Orchard, except it focuses on lands you control. Now, that does mean that, like, if for some reason you don't have a land that fixes you for your 3rd color or whatever the case is, it'll only make what you already have. But the other thing is, you're probably not playing a ton of lands that make specifically colorless mana. So Reflecting Pool should always be able to, even if it doesn't fix you for color, it gives you an extra colored pip, or an extra colored source. So I much prefer Reflecting Pool over Exotic Orchard, but in this list we're playing both. Just because Exotic Orchard's kind of like a command tower based on what your opponents have, and Reflecting Pool, if you have a command tower, is a second command tower. So it's relevant. Standard shocks, Godless Shrine, Blood Crib, Sacred Foundry. We are playing in this list because I think they're going to be cheap, a little cheap. They'll probably drop in price after the standard rotation, but they'll be in standard for 3 years. So during that 3-year stint, they might be a little expensive. But it's the Shadowy Backstreet, which is the Plains and Swamp Surveil land that comes into play tapped that you can fetch up. The Raucous Theater, it's the Swamp Mountain fetchable Surveil land, and Elegant Parlor, which is the Mountain Plains Surveil land that you can fetch up. We're also playing Isolated Chapel, Dragonskull Summit, Clifftop Retreat. They're your buddy lands, essentially. They're the lands that come into play untapped if you control. So like Isolated Chapel says, it comes into play untapped if you control a swamp or plains land. Doesn't necessarily have to be basic, just has to be a land with that type. Dragonskull Summit says essentially the same thing for Swamp Mountain, and Clifftop Retreat says the same thing for Mountain Plains. Smoldering Marsh is your fetchable Tango land from the Battle for Zendikar era. It's a swamp and a mountain, comes into play tapped unless you control 2 or more basics. Just standard, cheap, all that fun stuff. So I'm a big fan of this next cycle of lands that not a lot of people are a fan of. You don't see a ton of it, but I like them personally just because it might help you here and there depending. And that's your Ravnica bounce lands, which are based on the old Karoo cycle, but they're slightly better. Actually, they're a ton better. So the old Karoo cycle was the white one. Karoo says there's an entire cycle of these lands. They've got different names, but it's called the Karoo cycle. It's an entire cycle of lands for each of the individual colors. Karoo says it comes into play tapped unless you return an untapped Plains card to your hand. Karoo, or it comes into play tapped. If it comes into play, you either sacrifice it or you return an untapped Plains card from your battlefield to your hand. So obviously, you have to give up an available mana to have it come into play tapped. Otherwise, it's just going to get sacrificed. But it will tap for 1 white mana and 1 colorless mana. So there's an entire cycle of those. One for each of the monocolors, one for white, red, green, blue, black, all that fun stuff. That all basically say the same thing. They come into play tapped. You have to sacrifice them when they come into play, or return an untapped of, like for Karoo, it's Plains, but Jungle Hollow is the green one, and you have to return a forest. So the blue one you would return an island, the swamp or the black one you would return a swamp, and the red one you would return a mountain. But they have to be untapped. So you don't even get to use the mana from those lands that you're returning to your hand. The cycle that I'm referring to is far better. So they do enter the battlefield tapped. They still have that basis. But like Orzhov Basilica, so it's Orzhov related. It comes into play tapped. When you get to use it for mana, it taps for both a white and a black. So you tap it for... If you tap it for its normal mana ability, it adds a white and a black mana, not one or the other. Most will say, most lands that do something like this will say tap, add white or black. You get both when you use it. Again, it comes into play tapped, but when it comes into play, you return a land you control to its owner's hand. Doesn't have to be an untapped land, and it can be any land. So it doesn't have to be, you could, let's say, I don't know. Let's say you're in Orzhov, and you go turn 1 Plains, play a Sol Ring. Pass the turn. Let's say on your second turn, you use your Plains and your Sol Ring to play another card that normally costs you 3 mana, and you get some effect. But then your land drop for the turn is the Orzhov Basilica. So you play the Basilica, and you get to return that tapped Plains to your hand. So you still get to use the mana. Whereas the Karoo cycle would require you to return that Plains untapped to your hand. So that you wouldn't get to use the Plains. But, like I said, it doesn't have to be a Plains or a swamp. It could be any land in play. It could even be itself. There's lists for some deck lists that use the bounce cycles that these are, and they play a loop that's like, comes into play, ability on the stack, I'll return itself, and maybe some other ability goes off and whatever. But it gives you 2 colored mana instead of 1 colored mana and a colorless. You get to return any land you control back to its owner's hand. So it doesn't. The land that you return doesn't have to be untapped, which is relevant. Also, the clause doesn't have the you sacrifice it clause, because, and I've seen this, and this is where you have to pay attention, especially if you're a newer player. If you keep a hand that has like the Orzhov Basilica, or in this case the Rakdos Carnarium or the Boros Garrison, which are the red, black, and the red, white versions of the Basilica. If you're keeping a hand that has these lands in it, take your free mulligan in Commander, because that added clause of you have to return a land you control, well, when it comes into play, it's a land you control. So if you have no other lands in play, you have to return itself. So they have their benefit, but they also have their downside, which is why it doesn't have that sacrifice clause. Because even though you're not sacrificing it, it's still going back to your hand, and you've used your land drop for the turn. So it's not as great. It's actually probably worse. Because if you think about it, with the old Karoo cycle, if you didn't want to discard anything, you could play your Karoo land and not return something, and you have to sacrifice your Karoo land. But now you don't have to discard anything. This way, with the clause that these lands have, you would have to discard something. And obviously you don't want to discard a land, but you need other lands in play for these to be good. Or you need to be able to play multiple lands a turn for these to be good. Or at least be better. I personally think they're already infinitely better than the Karoo lands. But that's beside the point. But like I said, the Orzhov Basilica is the white-black one, Rakdos Carnarium is the red-black one, and Boros Garrison is the red-white one. They all come into play tapped. They'll all tap for 2 colored pips, and they all require you to return a land, not another, but a land you control to their owner's hand. And that phrasing is great, because if you're playing something like you play a spell and you take control of an opponent's land, and you kind of like want to put them a land drop behind, well, you can, if you take control of their land, you can use their land to do something and then play one of these and bounce their land back to their hand. So now one of their lands is back in their hand. You got to use it for mana. Most likely, hopefully, you got to use it for mana to do something. And you kind of ramped yourself maybe a wee bit. Kind of. So the next land cycle that we're playing in here are the better versions of Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. And the reason these are better is because you don't have to tap them and then sacrifice them. On top of that, they just flat out gain you a life. So Cabaret Courtyard is from New Capenna. This entire land cycle I'm going to talk about real quick is from New Capenna. Cabaret Courtyard's the first one on the list. When it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it. You have to sacrifice it. It has to go away. So you don't tap it to use the ability, which is relevant because if there's something in play that says you can't tap your lands for abilities or whatever, you could still play this land and use its effect, because it requires you to sacrifice it, but you don't tap it. And then whenever you sacrifice it, you get to search your deck for a basic mountain, forest, or plains card and put that card onto the battlefield tapped. And then you also gain a life. So you don't have to tap it to use the ability. It just auto-uses the ability itself. It's a better version of Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse in the fact that in addition to that factor, you also gain a life. But it's also better than the old Naya panoramas. So, which is something else we probably need, that like I would need to like do a better Mana Basis 2 video talking about like budget lands. But the old panorama cycle is a cycle of lands that would come into play. You could tap it for 1 colorless, and then later on you could pay 1, tap it, sacrifice it, and search your deck for a like the Naya panorama would let you search for a forest, mountain, or basic forest, basic mountain, basic plains card, put it in play tapped, and you would pay 1 to tap it, sacrifice it, and do the effect. So the Cabaret Courtyard is kind of like a combination of the Panorama Terramorphic Expanse, except you don't tap and sack, with the additional benefit of you also gain a life. Riveteer's Overlook is another land from the same cycle as the Cabaret Courtyard, except it lets you search your deck for a basic swamp, a basic mountain, or a basic forest card. So it gets you your red or black option. Cabaret Courtyard would get you your red or white option. Maestro's Theater, again, same land cycle. It lets you search your deck for a basic island, basic swamp, or basic mountain card and put it on battlefield tap. So that lets you get you a red-black option. And then the other one is Obscura Storefront. Again, same cycle. So there's 5 in total, but you can play 4 of the 5 in this cycle. The 5th one you could technically play, but it's only going to let you go get 1 of these land options. Whereas everything else I'm playing lets you get 2 of your options. So it's a little bit better fixing. But this one will let you get a basic plains, a basic islands, and a basic swamp. So it'll get you the white-black option. There were 2 red-black options, 1 red-white option was Naya, and then 1 white-black option. So there's one other one, which is, Sparas. There's one for the Bant color, which is green, white, blue. So the only option you could get from that is white, which is why we're not playing it, because it only lets you fetch 1. One of the other lands we're playing to kind of help fix for black mana, just because in my list there are almost twice as many black pips as any of the other colors. So black mana fixing's highly relevant, and that land is Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. We're not playing Cabal Coffers, just because if you do that loop, they either kill your Coffers or they kill your Urborg. Usually they just kill your Urborg. It makes the Coffers worse, and it hurts your fixing capabilities for black mana. So we're just playing the Urborg just to fix for black. We're not playing the Urborg Cabal Coffers land finesse fun stuff. But Urborg is a legendary land that says each land is a swamp in addition to its other types, to its other land types. So now every land in play, including Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, can tap for 1 black mana if you so choose. We are playing Bojuka Bog. So Bojuka Bog is one of those lands that works really well with those bounce lands. Bojuka Bog enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target player's graveyard. So you just exile every card in target player's graveyard. And it'll tap for black mana. So the reason I say it works well with your bounce lands is because you can play the Bojuka Bog, and then later in the game you can play one of your bounce lands and get the bog back so that you could exile somebody else's graveyard, depending on what the case is. Vault of the Archangel, it's one of the few utility lands we're playing. So it taps for a colorless, or you can pay 2 generic, a white and a black, and tap it, and creatures you control gain lifelink and death touch until end of turn. There are a few things in the deck that are going to care about you paying life to do things, or care about you losing life to do some other effect or whatever. So a utility land that gives all of your creatures lifelink being the most relevant, because we want to gain that life. But death touch, nothing to laugh at on the death touch. The added benefit of I have lifelink and death touch, meaning I'm going to gain as much life as I deal I'm going to gain an amount of life equal to the amount of damage I deal, but on top of that, every point of damage I deal is considered lethal because it's death touch damage. So here's a really nifty rule about death touch. If you have a creature with death touch that's dealing damage, 1 point of damage is considered lethal because it's death touch. So if you hit a creature, if a creature you control with death touch hits another creature for whatever reason, and let's say that creature's toughness is 3, well, you only have to deal 1 because it's death touch damage to be considered lethal. So you would need to regenerate. If they had a regeneration effect, you would regenerate from that. However, let's say that creature had 3 toughness and your creature had 3 power. Well, if you deal all 3 points to that creature has to regenerate 3 times, or twice, has to regenerate twice. It has to regenerate once from 3 damage, and then it has to regenerate again from an additional lethal damage effect based on the death touch ability. So it would have to regenerate twice, which is not something a whole lot of people know about. It's also not something players that I've played with from back when I started playing with. It's not something a lot of the old, a ton of the older players pay attention to or keep up with. Another fun thing about death touch damage, since 1 point is considered lethal, if you have a creature with death touch and trample is a green keyword that says any excess damage is dealt to whatever you were attacking. If you have death touch and trample, the other thing is trample is because you get to assign how much damage you do to something. Trample is actually what I would call, I don't know the full-fledged ruling on it, but what I would call a conditionary keyword, meaning I don't have to assign the excess damage to the thing I was attacking. If I have a creature with trample and I attack and you block with something that's got like 1 or 2 toughness, and there would normally be like 3 or 4 extra damage to go through via trample, I could have the trample damage go through, or I could just assign the full power amount of damage to the creature I'm hitting. It's very rare that happens. There are some very, very select moments where that's relevant. And when I say very select moments, I think I've seen 3 in my 24 years of playing. So it's very, very selective where you would see that. But that is something you can technically do, which is why I say it's a conditionary keyword, because you don't have to, but you can. But that being said, if you have a creature with trample and death touch, well, 1 point is considered lethal. So if I have a creature that's 3 power and you have a creature with 8 toughness, but my creature has trample and death touch, I don't care about your 8 toughness creature. It effectively has 1 toughness, and any extra damage I do beyond 1 is probably going to go to wherever I was attacking, which is something not a lot of newer players pay attention to. So a creature with trample and death touch is probably more deadly than a creature with just death touch. The most deadly creature to worry about on anybody's playing field or anything of that nature is a creature that has first strike and death touch, because it will always hit first, and because the creature has death touch, all the damage it's going to do is considered lethal damage. So you have to, if you don't have like an indestructible blocker or something of that nature, you have to put an extra, like a whole bunch more bodies in front of it because of the first strike death touch keyword combination. That is probably the most problematic 2 keyword combination on any creature would be first strike death touch. The next 2 word, because you don't see it that much, the next 2 word keyword combination that you would see is double strike death touch. And the reason that matters is because typically if you see double strike on a creature, the creature's probably got a low power number. But if you see death touch, it's probably a creature that's like, whenever I go out, I'm going to take something with me. If you ever see a creature with double strike and death touch, it knows it's going to die, but it's going to take a whole bunch of stuff. It's going to try and take as much stuff with it. So that's kind of something you want to watch out for. I know I'm rambling, but I'm rambling as these things pop in my head. So I want to try and finish out the mana base really quickly. We are playing the fetches, the Arid Mesa, the Bloodstained Mire, and the Marsh Flats to go fetch some of these lands, to go find some of these things. We're playing the better versions of the Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse common fetches that'll also gain you a life. We're playing 9 basics, 3 plains, 3 swamps, 3 mountains. So you've got 9 basics to try and hopefully not have a ton of come into play tapped lands and things of that nature. And then the next section that I went on to was the Mana Rock, Mana Ramp section. So we're playing Sol Ring, that's a given, that's a standard. We're playing Arcane Signet, it's another staple. We're also playing the Orzhov Signet, which is kind of like the Orzhov Basilica bounce land. You pay 2 generic mana to play it, and then you pay 1 to tap it and add both white and black to your mana pool. So, like, you know, a hugely relevant turn 1 is like an untapped land into Sol Ring, into either Orzhov Signet, Boros Signet, or Rakdos Signet. And then turn 2 is usually play another untapped land, use your Sol Ring to play one of the other signets, and then use 1 land to tap one of your 3 signets to, or one of your 2 signets to play the 3rd signet. And then you could use your other untapped land to activate one of your remaining signets and play Arcane Signet. And then you could use your Arcane Signet to activate the last, like, other 2-colored signet and play one of the talismans. So that'd be like turn 1 land, Sol Ring into Signet, turn 2 land, use Sol Ring, play Signet number 2, use a land, activate Signet, play Signet number 3, use land, activate Signet, play Arcane Signet, use that, play Talisman. Is 1, 2, so it's 4. That's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So on turn 3 you could have 10 potential mana, but it's almost entirely through your artifact Mana Rock stuff. But again, there's 1 for each of the 2-color guild combinations. It's Orzhov, Boros, and Rakdos. And then there's a talisman for each of the 2-color guild combinations. There's Talisman of Indulgence, which is Rakdos. It's red-black. It's 2 mana to play it. You can pay 1, or you can tap it to make a colorless, or you can tap it to add a red or black, and then it deals a damage to you. Talisman of Conviction, it's the same thing as the Indulgence, except it's for red-white. Talisman of Hierarchy, again, the same thing as Indulgence, except it's for white-black. All of the talismans have that additional clause of when you tap it to make colored mana, it deals you a damage. So again, like if you're having to use those for colored mana, it's going to hurt your life total. You're going to want to, you know, have some extra life gain. Now on to the creature portion. Bloodletter of Achlazotz. Bloodletter of Achlazotz. It's a vampire demon. It's a 4 mana, 2/4 with flying. If an opponent would lose life during your turn, they lose twice that much life instead. Now, the reason that's relevant is because in reminder text it says damage counts, or damage causes loss of life. So anything that says, like, if an opponent lost life this turn, do this effect, damage also causes damage causes the loss of life. So you get any triggers with that. However, if something says, if an opponent was dealt damage, do this effect, only damage is going to count. An effect that, like, forces your opponents to just lose life, like an effect that says each opponent loses X life or whatever the case is, that's only going to count for life loss. It's not going to count for damage. Roaming Throne is a newer creature that I've seen popping up here and there more. I don't know how I feel about it for 4 mana. It's 4 generic mana, but we included it in this list because I think it's a relatively cheap add-on. So it's 4 generic mana for an artifact creature, Golem. Has Ward 2. It says, as it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Roaming Throne is the chosen type, in addition to any other types it is. So in this deck, it would be a Vampire Golem. And it's a 4 generic for a 4/4. It also says if a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. So while this is in play with, like, your Edgar Markov, well, your Edgar Markov has 2 triggers. It has a trigger that happens that says whenever you cast a vampire spell, you make a vampire token. So if Roaming Throne and Edgar Markov are both in play, anytime you cast a vampire spell, you're making 2 tokens. Edgar Markov also has the additional triggered ability of whenever he attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So again, if you have Roaming Throne and Edgar Markov in play and you attack with Edgar Markov, you get 2 of the attack trigger instead of just 1. Sanctum Seeker, also following with the theme of triggers on vampires. It's 2 generic black for a 3/4 vampire knight. Whenever a vampire you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So now every vampire that swings while this is in play and the Roaming Throne is in play is each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. That's effectively what it does. It technically happens differently on the stack if for some reason there's a nasty poopy head blue player that has a really bad trick up their sleeve. So essentially what it says is with those 2 cards in play, whenever a vampire you control attacks, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. The way it works on the stack is whenever a vampire you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and then you put a secondary copy of that ability on the stack if you have the Roaming Throne. So if you have 4 vampires swing, the way to shortcut it so that it works is each opponent loses 2 and you gain 2. So if you're swinging with 4 vampires, each opponent's going to lose 8 and you're going to gain 8. But the way it actually works is it puts 8 triggers of each opponent losing 1 and you gaining 1 on the stack. And the reason that matters is because there are things that care about you do an effect when this happens, or like there's a ton of creatures out there that say you do some effect when you gain life. So the reason how it works versus how the shortcut shows that it works is if you have one of those creatures that says whenever you gain a life, do this effect, you technically have 8 triggers of that ability happening. But the shortcut variation is each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And that's per a vampire that swings. And the other thing is doesn't care where your vampires are going. Just says opponents lose this and you gain this. It doesn't care where your vampires are going. You could be attacking the person at the highest life total and all of your opponents are going to lose 1 for each vampire you control that's swinging, and you're going to gain 1 for each vampire that you control that's swinging. Next up is Legion Lieutenant. Other vampires you control get +1/+1. It's a white and a black for a vampire knight that is a 2/2. It's a vampire lord. Most of the vampire lords that I've seen in more recent years are not strictly in black. They are in black plus a color, which is why I think if you go mono black or if you go red black, you're missing out on more of the lords. And the lords can be relevant enough. Captivating Vampire, it's 1 black. Other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1. That's great. It's a 3-mana 2/2 lord. Has an additional ability. Probably one of the better additional abilities among lords throughout Magic's capable history. And that is tap 5 untapped vampires you control, gain control of target creature. It becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. So tap 5 untapped vampires you control, steal the biggest threat in play, or at least the biggest threat to you in play. Not only do you gain control of it, it becomes a vampire. So now it's buffed by all your vampire buffs and affects everything else that cares about vampires that you have. Stromkirk Captain is 1 generic red and black for a 2/2. It has first strike. Other vampires you control get +1/+1 and have first strike. So like those are your 3 relevant lords. There's 1 in white black, 1 in red black, 1 in solid black. The 1 in solid black being the strongest one if it lives the longest, because it'll let you take other creatures and turn them into vampires. The red black one is not as strong as the Captivating, but it's up there because it gives all of your other vampires +1/+1 in first strike. Just and outright, they always have first strike as long as he's in play. So that's relevant because they all get to hit first. Whereas the white-black one is just a +1/+1 buff to your other vampires. But it's also 2 mana. It's a 2 mana 2/2 instead of a 3 mana 2/2. So that's why, I feel like that's probably why it doesn't have that extra benefit. I feel like if it cost you 1 generic mana, they'd probably say vampires you control have lifelink. Because it's in white-black. So instead of giving it the lifelink thing, they just said it's just going to cost 2 mana and just be a lord. Cordial Vampire is whenever Cordial Vampire or another creature dies, you put a 1/1 counter on each vampire you control. It's a double black pip 1/1 vampire. But it says whenever it or any other creature in play dies, you get to put a 1/1 counter on each vampire you control. That's relevant because if you have this in play and you've got a bunch of small vampires, but like maybe you're not the threat at the time, and somebody swings into another player who's got a big board state, and they have to, let's say they have to give up like half their board state so that they don't die or something of that nature. Let's say they give up 4 creatures in the process. Well, that's 4 +1/+1 counters on all vampires you control. Now all of a sudden, because they were the biggest threat and they had to give up some stuff, your board just got bigger. So I feel like that's a really good 2 mana include. Again, it's double black pip, and that's black, that's it. Malakir Bloodwitch had a very nasty nickname when it was in Standard. Unfortunately, I cannot repeat the nickname for YouTube purposes. It's a 3 generic black for a Vampire Shaman, and it's a 4/4. It has flying, and it has protection from white. That's relevant because some of Vampire's most hated things are in the color white. So it's like, I can block white things and not care. However, on the flip side of that, some of white's most hated things are in black. So there are things in white that say protection from black. So that's 2 sides of the same coin, essentially. However, there's an additional ability for Malakir Bloodwitch, which is when Malakir Bloodwitch enters the battlefield, each opponent loses life equal to the number of vampires you control, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. So, if you have the Bloodwitch come into play, and then you have like a total of 5 vampires, each opponent loses 5, and you gain 15. Because you're an Edgar Markov, let's say you went a turn 1, 1-drop vampire, a turn 2, 2-drop vampire, turn 3. Let's say you went turns 1 through 4, a vampire spell, and it made a token, and all of that got to stick around. Well, on turn 1, you have 2 vampires. You have your cast, the one you cast, and your token. On turn 2, you have the one you cast and your token. On turn 3, you have the one you cast and your token. So now you're up to 6. On turn 4, you have the one you cast and your token, and that makes 8. So on turn 5, whenever you cast the Blood Witch, because she's a vampire, on the cast you make a token. So it puts you at 9. When she comes into play, she's at 10. Each opponent loses 10, and you gain 30. And that's pretty dumb, pretty amazing. Obviously, numbers can get much higher if it's later in the game and you have a super excess number of mana, and you're like, here's all these 1, 2, and 3-drop vampires. And then you save 5 mana, and you're just like, I made an instant board state. Now I'm going to play the Blood Witch, and it's a highly relevant board state because the Blood Witch makes the extra token. Everybody loses X. I've seen games where you go the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, and then on turn 5 you play the Blood Witch, and each opponent loses 10, and you gain 30. And even in those cases, usually you as the vampire player are still a problem and very difficult to deal with because you got to find a way to get rid of all those of all the extra vampires that you're playing. And some of the ways to get rid of the Blood Witch that are very common in Commander are in your white color pie, and so it makes it difficult to get rid of the Blood Witch. There are other colors that can do it, but a lot of the relevant ones where you just want to get rid of the Blood Witch and never see her again are in white. So the fact that it has protection from white makes it very likely that it's going to be the last vampire that you get to keep. But that's still heavy problem. Blood Artist, it's a good one. It's a good 2 mana one. Whenever Blood Artist or another creature you control dies, target opponent loses a life, you gain a life. Great. If you're losing, it says, another creature dies. Doesn't have to be yours, could be any creature. It's great. It's targeted, shoot them for 1, you gain 1 kind of deal. Charismatic Conqueror, it's one of the solid white ones that I feel like is really, really good that I don't really see people play an absolute ton. It might be in their decks, but I don't see it that often. Like, it doesn't seem to show up, but it's really relevant. It's 1 generic and a white for a vampire soldier. It's a 2/2, so it's a 2 mana 2/2. It has vigilance. So attacking doesn't cause the creature to tap, so that's relevant. Also says when an artifact or creature enters the battlefield untapped and under an opponent's control, they may tap that permanent. If they don't, you make a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. So it's highly relevant, because if you can get this down before anybody else plays a Soul Ring, you get this down. Let's say you go first and you manage to play this on turn 1 some way, somehow. And then everybody else goes and they're like, I have a turn 1 Soul Ring. Okay, well, they're probably going to tap their Soul Ring, because it's not often that you're going to see a player go, I have a turn 1 Soul Ring and a follow-up play. However, if they have a follow-up play, they're probably going to give you the 1/1. So like say you have this on turn 1, and then your next opponent goes and they play a Soul Ring and they're like, I have a follow-up play, so I'll let you have the 1/1, and let's say the follow-up play is like Arcane Signet. Well, if they don't have a follow-up play beyond the Arcane Signet, there's no reason for them to give you an extra 1/1, but you did get a 1/1 out of the Soul Ring. However, so early game it's relevant, because all of your early game, like that's the other thing. If you're playing against players that play tons of treasures, like let's say you're playing against somebody that has a Smothering Tithe in play, and you have a Charismatic Conqueror in play, you want your opponents to not pay the 2 mana to give the player who has the Smothering Tithe, that is your opponent, to let them have the treasures, because then you want that player to either tap the treasure immediately for the Charismatic Conqueror's ability, or let you have a 1/1, because you get that option of one of those. So it's like, when I was digging for some stuff, this jumped to like the top of the charts for some of the stuff I was looking into, and I'm like, well, why is nobody playing this? Or if they are playing this, why does it never like show up when it's relevant? It's one of those vampires that has a good ability that just seems to not show up for some reason, and I don't understand it, but I think it's a really good vampire. There's Markov Baron. It's 2 generic and a black. It has Convoke. Convoke's not typically an ability that's in black. It's usually an ability that's predominantly in green-white. So it's nice to see that you have a vampire that has Convoke, so you can use other vampires to help pay for it. It has lifelink. That's great. It's a 3 mana 2/2 with lifelink. That's good. Other vampires you control get +1/+1. On top of that, it's a Lord. It has Convoke. It has lifelink. It's 3 mana. It's your typical Lord number, which is 3 mana. And it's a 2/2, which is your typical Lord value, is a 2/2 for 3. So it's a Lord, it has lifelink, it has Convoke. Could it get any better? Oh yes, it has Madness. So if for some reason you discard this card, if an effect requires you to discard a card and you end up discarding this card, it has a Madness cost, which is the same as its casting cost. And you could still pay for the Madness cost using the Convoke ability. So it's a 3 mana 2/2 Lord that literally says, I want you to have the most possible ways to play me that are semi-relevant. And I have lifelink. And other vampires you control get +1/+1. And, here's all these ways to make me cheaper. Cheaper to potentially free. Cruel Celebrant. It's white-black for a 1/2 vampire. Whenever Cruel Celebrant or another creature or planeswalker you control dies, each opponent loses a life and you gain life. You gain a life. So that's good. That's another Blood Artist, but it's specifically for your side of the board. But it says each opponent loses a life instead of target opponent. So it gets around those pesky things that make it so that your opponents are hexproof. Just because it says each opponent. Clavileño, First of the Blessed. This was a newer one that when I went digging, I started looking at. It says whenever you attack, target attacking vampire that isn't a demon becomes a demon in addition to its other types. It gains when this creature dies, draw a card, and create a tapped 4/3 white and black vampire demon creature token with flying. Now, that's relevant because it doesn't say until end of turn they have this ability. It just says they have this ability. So even if they don't die the turn you turn them into a demon, like if they stick around and you get to hit multiple demons with this ability, you're going to make, when they die, you're going to make multiple 4/3 white and black vampire demon creature tokens with flying, which is highly relevant. And the ability says when you attack, target attacking vampire that isn't a demon becomes a demon. So he doesn't specifically have to attack, which is relevant. He just has to be in play. The other thing is the ability states any non-demon vampire that's attacking. So if you do attack with him, you can target himself. A lot of things that do these kinds of abilities that have like both of those clauses or all of that clause together, because it's not separated through different paragraphs. It's going to say, usually it'll say this creature has to attack, and then it'll also include another attacking creature. So it'll make it so that the creature can't attack alone, which is relevant because this one can. Or and not necessarily and it'll also make it so that it won't get the benefit itself. You can't target itself with the benefit. You have to target something else. So it can't go it alone. Most of the other abilities will make it so that it can't go it alone. And if it goes, you can't use the ability on itself. You have to use the ability on something else. So this one kind of doesn't care about either one of those. It says, I can go alone if I go at all. I don't have to. That's the other thing. I don't have to go to get this ability. I just have to be in play. And then the other portion of that is I can hit myself with the ability if I really want to. So I can be the problem that maybe lets me stick around for a little bit. Mavern Fane, Dusk Apostle. It's 2 generic and a white for a 2/2. It's a vampire cleric. Whenever you one or more non-token vampires you control attack, you make a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. So that cares about your attack triggers. So specifically, attacking gives you the token, regardless of how many things you attack with. So that one's, pretty good. You're usually only going to get one combat. So normally it's only going to give you one dude. But with the throne that we talked about earlier, if you have that in the throne and you swing in with something, you're going to get 2 vampire tokens. So that's pretty good. Again, my list is supposed to be a budget-friendly list. So it's more focused on things that are going to make your tokens and things that care about. There is a sub-reanimation and a sub-aristocrat theme in the list, but it's predominantly more about, I want to have my lords in play. I want to attack with things. I want to get these kinds of triggers, and do stuff. But there is the token theme, a sub aristocrat theme, and a sub reanimation theme, just to kind of, because it's mostly creatures, so it's a little of like trying to get there with dudes, maybe stick around for a little bit and kill people through damage. It would be very easy to make this more streamlined, a whole bunch of like synergistic effects, and then like kill people and not ever have to actually do combat damage. So the next thing is Champion of Dusk. It's 3 generic black. It's a 4/4. It's a vampire. It's specifically a vampire knight, but it's a vampire. When it enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. Card draw, because this color combination, the red, white, black color combination, has a difficult time drawing cards. Also, the effect forces, you're going to lose life for drawing those cards. So again, back to that Vault of the Archangel, all of your creatures, for 5 mana for 1 turn, all of your creatures are going to have lifelink and death touch. So you gain life. Relevant. Alinda the Dusk Rose, 2 generic, white, black. It's also a vampire knight. It's a 1/1. It has lifelink. It also has, when another creature dies, you put a 1/1 counter on Alinda. So that's relevant because it doesn't care about specifically yours. Just when any other creature dies, you get a 1/1 counter. That's also a triggered ability. So if you have Throne and this in play and some other creature dies, that's a trigger. So Throne's going to give her 2 counters. She has another ability, which is when Alinda dies, you make X 1/1 white vampire creature tokens with lifelink, where X is Alinda's power. That's another triggered ability. So if the Throne's in play, and let's say Alinda's like a 20 power creature, and for some reason you have to give up Alinda, well, you get her death trigger because it is her trigger specifically. So the Throne's going to see that and say, you get 2 of those. So now instead of just making 20 tokens, you're making 40 tokens. Also relevant. Forerunner of the Legion. It's one of the solid white ones that I feel like needs to be in the vampire deck. it goes back to the old like tribal typal stuff from like Lorwyn, where you cared about elementals, elves, goblins, tree folk, things of that nature. It's 2 generic and a white for 2/2. Says when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a vampire card, which is relevant because you go find any vampire card you want, reveal it, shuffle your deck, put that card on top. It also says whenever another vampire enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. That's not the highly relevant portion. Now that could be the highly relevant portion if for some reason you have this in play and you do something and you make a ton of dudes, so now you've got a whole bunch of extra bonus triggers to give things +1/+1 until end of turn. That's not the real reason you play it. The real reason you play it is you go find a vampire card and you put it on top, so you're guaranteed to get a vampire on the follow-up turn, unless somebody's playing mill and they're over there. Do something about that. Yahenni, Undying Partisan. It's 2 generic and a black for a 2/2 with haste. It's an Aether-born vampire from the Kaladesh Aether Revolt era. Says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you put a 1/1 counter on Yahenni, Undying Partisan. Another ability is you can sacrifice another creature. Yahenni gains indestructible until end of turn. So if you've got Yahenni and some other creatures in play, well, you can go ahead and somebody plays a board wipe, you can go ahead and give up one of those creatures to make Yahenni indestructible, so that hopefully he lives through the board wipe. It's going to depend on the board wipe, but hopefully he lives through it. Rockish Air, it's 2 and a red for a 2/2. Whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So for any vampires that get through that deal combat damage to a player, they're going to get a little bit bigger. Viscera Seer, it's a vampire for 1 black. Says you can sacrifice a creature to scry 1. So that's highly good to an extent.